Greetings to all of you, student participants in California Rare Book School, faculty, colleagues, friends, members of the Book Club of California. Thank you all for coming tonight. I think it would be nice if the students would all just raise your hands so we get a sense of the number of you that are all here this evening. And we have three faculty members this week. Gerald Cloud, let's see, Julie Sweetkin-Singer, and Gowan Weaver, I think, was not able to make it this evening. At any rate, we have one course happening here at the Book Club of California. Thank you very much to the Book Club of California and to you, Jennifer, and to Mark Sherman, president of the book club, and John Crichton, for allowing us to use the wonderful facility to hold a course here. It's really terrific to be able to do that. Thank you to the Bancroft Library for their support. We have 2 courses that are going on there this week. It's really wonderful for us to have all this help from those of you in the Northern California book community. So thank you again. This year, California Rare Book School is celebrating a decade. We're 10 years old. It's really a pleasure this evening to introduce our speaker. I've been wanting to get her involved in California Rare Book School for some time now, and I finally succeeded. But we'll have to get you involved in Southern California too, Lori, at some point. Let me tell you about her a bit. Dr. Lori Anne Ferrell, who is Fellow of the Royal Historical Society, is Director of Early Modern History and Chair of the English Department at the Claremont Graduate University in Claremont, California. So you see, it's the Claremont in Southern California. We have brought her up from there. Her PhD is from Yale University in history, yet she is equally well-versed in early modern literature. She teaches both history and English, as well as book and printing history. Her research concentrates on the effects of religion and political change has had on early modern texts. Her publications are many, and she has curated exhibitions at the Huntington Library on the King James Bible and on extra illustrated books. She has just returned from a sabbatical spent in the UK and at the Newberry Library in Chicago. And tonight, we are fortunate to hear her thoughts on a subject that I think she's been working on during this period, and that's Victorian bibliophilia and how the Parker Society invented the Reformation. So welcome, Lori Anne. We're delighted to have you here.
Well, thank you, Susan, so much for inviting me. I'm glad we finally were able to arrange this. It does seem interesting that we couldn't arrange anything in LA, but we could arrange it up here. But it's nice to come and actually see what rain looks like. I've enjoyed that. That's pretty exciting for me. And I want to thank Shruti and everyone here at the California Book Club, because I'm a person who sends 6 billion questions a day about what about the PowerPoint. And we'll find out, won't we? But everybody's been very patient, and I am very happy for all the hospitality. A quick note on my PowerPoint, if it works, and we do hope it does, you'll know the things that aren't actually taken from an archive that I was working at in the Wren Library at Trinity College, Cambridge. You'll notice kind of a big, unwieldy-looking book, and a lot of the shots that I'll be showing you are from that archive. I now have found out that so many of you are doing descriptive bibliography, and all I can say, would you please go to Trinity College and properly catalog this stuff that I was pouring through last year. And last, a thank you to someone who isn't here, but I got the most interesting letter from a member of the book club named Ian Jackson, who said, well, if you're working on the Parker Society, I don't come to lectures, but if you're working on the Parker Society, you should have some of this stuff. And he sent me this wonderful sort of catch of materials about, genteel clergymen going broke, trying to keep their subscriptions going to these associations I'll be talking about tonight. So thank you, Mr. Jackson. And I sent him a note to thank him. But next time you hear this talk, I think a lot of the information I got from him may be incorporated in it. So let me begin with Victorian bibliophilia, or how the Parker Society invented the English Reformation with a little help from their enemies. In 1855, The elected council of the Parker Society for the Publication of the Works of the Fathers and Early Writers of the Reformed English Church published their 13th and final report, marking the end of a prolific 15-year history. Their tone was typically pious and justifiably valedictory. The council desired to express their thankfulness to God that a very important object has been attained, that the works of the leading English reformers have been made for all future time easily accessible to the theological student, and a fuller light thereby thrown upon the principles of the Church of England, the value and importance of which every reader will be prepared to appreciate. Now, 160 years later, the word appreciate fails to describe the debt that generations of British history scholars owe the Parker Society, that 7,000 member-strong Church of England subscription society, which between 1841 and 1855 underwrote the transcription, translation, and publication of definitive printed editions of the writings of the 16th century Reformation, books of Protestant theology, ecclesiastical correspondence, Church of England liturgies, private devotionals, religious poetry, all dating from the reigns of the Tudors from Henry VIII to Elizabeth I. These Parker Society editions, 54 books in all, still grace the open stacks of most university and divinity school libraries, and citations of their contents are still to be found plentifully in most books on English political and religious history. But in an age of ever-growing electronic resources, when we can dial up digitized copies of early English books online, it has become fashionable to disavow our dependence on the editions made for us by such bibliophile associations as the Parker Society. A typical footnote in a book published by Cambridge University Press last year has this to say about one Parker Society production. This volume can be unreliable. The editor, James Schofield, sometimes sanitized language to suit Victorian sensibilities. For example, a condemnation of papist buggery now reads papist unnatural lust. Shocking, shocking. But it is only very recently that historians of early modern England have looked so askance at the multitude of the venerable modern editions, and by this I mean, of course, the 19th and early 20th century editions of printed document collections, that they have always relied on, that I have always relied on, and have been checking out of the library since my undergraduate days. But of course, no historian consults Parker Society editions in order to understand Victorian prudery. We consult them in order to conduct research into the English Reformation under the Tudors. But the Victorians do have a lot to answer for, like, say, the Alcuin Club, the Roxbury Club, the Chatham Society, the Camden Society, the Calvin Society, the Religious Tract Society, the Surtees Society, the Ecclesiastical History Society, the Fuller's Worthies Society. In short, like all British bibliographic associations, the Parker Society was a 19th century enterprise with a mission intent upon not only collecting, but also reestablishing England's common understanding of the past. So tonight's talk represents a small part of my ongoing research into the private societies and bibliophile associations that, in essence, introduced historians like me, trained up in an age before digitization and EBO, to the real stuff of British history in the age of Henry VIII, Edward VI, Bloody Mary, and Elizabeth I. Now, this talk is about a scholarly phenomenon rarely commented on by my fellow academics: the extraordinary proliferation and growth of subscription associations organized solely to publish accurate editions of historic and religious documents in the 19th century. But be warned, this is no genteel and pious Victorian tale, but a shocking narrative of the politics of publication, of borrowing books from libraries and not returning them, of foolhardy runs on the London book and manuscript auction markets, of take-no-prisoners collecting and dog-in-the-manger possessiveness, all peopled by bibliophiles determined not only to corner the market in 16th century religious memorabilia, but also to rewrite history. So let me begin this lurid tale at its beginnings. After private talks in the spring and appeals to a targeted audience in the summer of 1840, Anthony, Lord Ashley Cooper, the future Earl of Shaftesbury, issued a general call for subscribers to a new bibliographic association, one that, in the words of one of its founding members, planned to, quote, republish the best writers of the 16th century. This new society drew its inspiration from the Camden Society, named for the antiquarian William Camden, itself formed only 2 years earlier. Both fledgling societies proclaimed a similar mission: to collect, transcribe, edit, and preserve, by way of publishing, documentary sources relative to the history of England. Ashley Cooper's new society, however, had a more chronologically and culturally specialized purpose than Camden's, and so it selected as its namesake this handsome guy, Queen Elizabeth I, Archbishop of Canterbury, Matthew Parker, who died in 1575. Now that choice spoke volumes. Parker was England's best-known antiquary in the first great age of what we might call Protestant collecting. The Dictionary of National Biography situates his historic significance in interestingly balanced terms for the DNB. It identifies Parker as both Archbishop of Canterbury and patron of scholarship. Parker's life testifies to the fact that cataclysmic social and cultural change in any present day invariably compels people to reconsider and rewrite the past, and in order to do so, start madly collecting books. Like all Tudor Protestant clerics, Parker was initially trained up for the Roman Catholic priesthood. A fellow of Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, he was ordained deacon and priest in 1527 and began his intensive theological training that same year, when Cambridge University was still roiling from the after effects of the papal condemnation of Martin Luther, and books, like people, were in very real danger of being consigned to flames. Parker's own doctrinal attitudes developed over time, but early on we find him sympathetic to the new religious ideas out of Geneva and Germany, privileging preaching over the Mass, scripture over human authority, and faith over works. This sympathy soon led him to document his own perilously changing times. Recognizing their future significance, Parker began to save the letters and transcribe the verbal testimonies of the Henrician martyrs. Determined to prove that England's Reformation did not proceed from a spirit of heretical innovation, but was instead a restoration of the pristine beliefs and practices of early Christianity, Parker became a now legendary collector of books that proved the truth of his convictions. Volumes on Anglo-Saxon language and culture, European humanism, medieval and early church history. His rising reputation as a scholar with interest in establishing proof of a native-speaking Christianity that predated the Norman yoke led to a commission in 1560 by the German author-compilers of the famous Ecclesiastica Historica. These Magdeburg centuriators, so called because they came from that German city and their work was chapter divided by centuries, had asked Matthew Parker to acquire English manuscript sources for their research. And the request transformed Parker from a collector into a collector and a cataloger. From 1560, he was on the lookout for manuscript sources in English libraries, spying and searching, as he wrote, for credible information that documented the presence of such precocities as reformist thinking in early church councils, medieval outrage over papal misdeeds, and scriptural translation before the age of Tyndale. It also transformed the Archbishop into that most loathsome of all readers, a non-returner of borrowed books. A letter of 1568 from Elizabeth I's Privy Council assured the owners of aristocratic and other libraries that her archbishop would return all borrowed materials after a time of perusing the same and to make restitution of them again. But somehow, at the end of his life, Parker seems to have had in his possession more than 800 printed books and 500 manuscripts, now listed as part of his personal inventory. And then upon his death, he bequeathed most of these borrowed tomes to Corpus Christi College, where he had once been master, thus allowing the college, who never returned them either, to boast ever since of possessing one of the finest college libraries in Great Britain. Here then was the man Lord Ashley Cooper's newly fledged Victorian society wished to emulate: a preserver, a collector, a finder's keeper, and a maker of historic literary canons. In short, a guy with really overdue book finds. Now, the Parker Society's scholarly impulses likewise reflected the conflicted and questionably acquisitive spirit of their times. In the established Church of England, the 19th century was an epoch dominated by the conflict between two forces: evangelicalism, what we sometimes now call Low Church, and the Oxford Movement, what we sometimes now call the High Church. As we shall see, this conflict played out rather spectacularly in a set of religious subscription society book wars and in intemperate demands on private libraries and auction houses. In fact, the Parker Society's initial public announcement, published in weekly and monthly ecclesiastical magazines on both sides of the Atlantic, gave pride of place to the following information. The whole of the dues received will be expended in reprinting the writings of the Reformers without abridgment, alteration, or omission, so as to supply each subscriber a copy of every work that is printed in return for his or her subscription. Not a single copy of any work will be printed which is not positively engaged. Note here the essential fact that the making of these unabridged editions was to be underwritten by subscription. The Parker Society was thus not simply financing the printing of books, but summoning into existence a like-minded, self-selecting, voluntary community, one, moreover, whose own opinions, so positively engaged, would determine the content and the values of the works it commissioned. This elevated its mission, from the establishment of yet another book printing scheme, made possible by the introduction of the British uniform penny post, to a rallying cry to fellow travelers in the aftermath of the politically volatile parliamentary decision in 1829 to grant English Catholics their full civil rights, a decision that threatened the political monopoly enjoyed by the established Church of England. It was, in short, a particularly bookish evangelical campaign, not only for hearts, which is always the evangelical stronghold, but also now for minds. Now, the Society's initial plans, a timeline for publication capped at a decade, a subscriber list capped at 4,000 people, turned out to be wildly underambitious. Every initial expectation was exceeded within a matter of months. In the end, the association labored 15 years to serve its more than 7,000 subscribers, each of whom paid £1 a year to receive 2 to 4 volumes per annum. The commission proved the salvation of Cambridge University Press, which had just undergone the ruinous expense of investing in steam-powered presses and then unluckily lost its privileged status to print the Book of Common Prayer and the Bible. So the Parker Society was the answer to their prayers. Once assured of financing and a dedicated press, the Society's editorial board began to select its 16th century authors, a roster of, quoting the American Quarterly Register, those venerable divines by whose instrumentality the Reformation of the Church of England was effected. The Parker Society's initial prospectus of 1840 had included a long list of potential authors, names ranging from the outspoken Oxford martyrs Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley, who died in the reign of Mary I at the stake, to the late Elizabethan Archbishop John Whitgift, who died quietly in his sleep after a career spent persecuting outspoken radicals in Elizabeth's church, and who undoubtedly would have done the same to Latimer and Ridley had they not violently predeceased him. In establishing this canon of literature, the Parker Society was providing, however, a counterweight to a slightly earlier subscription venture, launched by other, very different spokespersons in the Church of England, men with a very different approach to the political emancipation of English Catholics. Led by editors Edward Pusey, John Keble, and most famously John Henry Newman, this subscription venture, known as a Library of Fathers of the Holy Catholic Church, anterior to the division of the East and West, had attracted about 600 members in 1838, each of whom paid 9 shillings per book to receive editions of the works of the Christian patristic authors, both Greek and Latin, now translated into English. Newman's Library of the Fathers was established, seemingly paradoxically, to offer now emancipated English Catholics a new scholarly inducement to join the Church of England, rather than practice the ancient faith they could now embrace openly and legally. In the prospectus to this subscription venture, Newman had written, "It appears an act of especial charity to point out to such of them as are dissatisfied with the state of their own church a body of ancient Catholic truth, free from the errors alike of modern Rome and of Ultra-Protestantism." Now here Newman calls for now emancipated English Catholics to consider reconciliation to the Church of England, arguing that the Church had in fact enjoyed a lasting and shared history with pre-modern Roman Catholicism, here documented in the translated writings of men like Chrysostom, Origen, and Augustine. In so doing, however, he revealed that his real target lay much closer to home, in the large, busy, very successful, very evangelical wing in the same Church of England, a thriving cohort Newman chose to label not mainstream, but ultra-Protestant. In fact, Newman's Library of the Fathers was itself responding to several recent and robustly anti-Catholic English book series produced by that same evangelical wing, most notably Lee Richmond's The Fathers of the English Church, printed between 1807 and 1812. We're actually moving backward in time, an unusual thing for a historian to do to you. In these volumes, Richmond, a leading light of Church of England evangelicalism, reprinted lengthy selections from, among other 16th century authors, John Fox's Acts and Monuments, that reliable master text of English anti-Catholicism, more popularly known to Victorians and to us as Fox's Book of Martyrs. Reprints of the Acts and Monuments had issued with regularity from English presses ever since its first publication in 1563. But by the 1830s, the blood-soaked, fire-singed history of the Tudor Reformation had become offensive to Newman and his fellow members in what was already being called the Oxford Movement or the Tractarian Movement. In short, political emancipation of Catholics had sent both wings of the established Church of England, high and low, evangelical and Tractarian, scurrying in search of their fathers. Newman's 1838 subscription venture located its patrimony in the first 11 centuries of the Christian era. The Parker Society decided instead to begin with the 1520s and end at 1603, its own fathers and writers of the Reformed Church of England becoming a roll call of the works of eminent Tudors, such men as Nicholas Ridley, Edmund Grindal, Thomas Cranmer, Miles Coverdale, Hugh Latimer, John Jewell, William Tyndale, John Bale, John Whitgift, and finally, they remembered Matthew Parker. The roster was 26 authors in all, with several published in two or more volumes. It comprised the works of the martyrs made by Queen Mary between 1552 and 1558, and also of the churchmen who succeeded them when Bloody Mary's fires of faith burnt out, and her Protestant sister Elizabeth took the throne. The former men witnesses to what they considered an apocalyptic age of persecution, the latter safely engaged in building what they increasingly realized would be a lasting institution. Thus, one shelf of Parker Society books. Sorry, they're really quite ugly at this stage of their lives. Uniform, monolithic, monochromatic, sort of, portrays two 16th century reformations over time. The early one that launched, as from pyres and scaffolds, the persecuted, nearly defeated Protestant church of a Latimer or a Ridley, and the latter one that witnessed the consolidation of the English Reformed Church under Elizabeth I. The uniform design, brown covers with an embossed image of Parker's archiepiscopal coat of arms, you'll have to trust me on this one, and the near uniform size of society volumes was thus meant, I think, to provide a historical, documentary argument with a physical equivalent to the hard-won order and uniformity of the Church of England by the end of the reign of Elizabeth I. I need to drink water. I actually need that glass of wine over there. But we'll wait. But what are the content of these books? The Parker Society canon was shaped most significantly by the text to be found in a very lively 19th century rare book and manuscript market. The third decade of the 19th century had ushered in a constant stream of tercentenary anniversaries of the English Reformation, celebrating many milestones, the most significant being perhaps the first official English translation of the Bible in 1539. This in turn brought new attention to those folks who collected and to those folks who auctioned off historical materials dating from the first decades of the Reformation era. As the General Council of the Parker Society once reported, heretofore the writings of the divines of the Reformation age were so rare that it was difficult for any but those who had ready access to the large libraries of the country to obtain an extended acquaintance with them. It is true that some few pieces, such as the Apology of Bishop Jewell and the Sermons of Bishop Latimer, were popularly known. But these and other volumes of the kind were little more than specimens and served mainly to indicate the mine was rich, if only it could be worked out. Now, there's a lot of attitude packed into that short paragraph. The metallurgical allusion suggests the Society's determination to dig more deeply into the foundation principles of the national church. The remark about large libraries indicates the Society's ambitions to extend the public range of religious education in Britain. Excuse me. And the citation of Jewell and Latimer as the only popularly known early modern religious writers of the day underscores the Society's determination to reconnect the split personality of the 16th century Church of England, an institution housing two kinds of Protestant defenders, those who spilt ink and those who spilt their own blood. The Council's remarks also reveal that one principle in attracting subscribers in this age could be the promise of the new and the exclusive, that in financing its efforts, the paying members of the Parker Society would not only gain a kind of access to aristocratic and university libraries, but also be able to fill their own shelves with now cheap reproductions of their contents. This acquisitiveness, however, went well beyond the commercial. In portraying their list of authors as representative, the Parker Society editorial board had also to address the question of whether their series was going to be comprehensive. Their concerns were aired annually at association meetings, editorial boards, and privately between members. Now, the Wren Library at the Trinity College, Cambridge, holds the largest collection of records relating to the Parker Society, including the correspondence of one George Stokes, who, it seems safe to say, was a persistent irritant to a Mr. Dawson Turner, Esquire, a lawyer in Colchester. Their correspondence contains our best private documentation of the work of the Society, in no small part because George Stokes was an inexhaustible letter writer, and Dawson Turner apparently saved every letter ever sent to him. The letter of George Stokes to Dawson Turner with which I open this talk also reveals the Society's anxiety to locate and publish the fullest record possible. In the course of our preliminary arrangements, it's been suggested that the writings of Bishop Ridley would be suitable for early publication. And it has been mentioned that you have in your valuable library some remains of that venerable prelate, which have not yet been published. May I make the inquiry whether this information is correct, and whether you might be inclined to take into consideration the importance of allowing any such remains to be added to the edition now contemplated? This letter marks the beginning of a year-long epistolary relationship, in which the wooing was frustratingly one-sided. Unwilling to take no for an answer, in his relentless pursuit of Turner's impressive collection of early modern autographs and letters, Stokes spent a considerable part of the next year sending Turner updated Parker Society prospectuses and examples of proof sheets, as if to argue to Turner that there was always time to stop press and add a transcription from his private stash of 16th century manuscripts. Stokes' letters invoke the names of mutual friends or influential patrons and always importuned, begging Turner to allow Stokes on behalf of the Parker Society to purchase the Ridley letters, or failing that, to transcribe them, or failing that, to finance a précis of their contents drawn up by the owner. But in the end, it appears that all Dawson Turner ever did for the Parker Society was allow Stokes to make one brief half-hour visit to his vaunted library, wherein Stokes was only allowed to confirm the handwriting of the Marian martyr John Bradford. And for that alone, Turner got a handsome thank you paragraph in that particular Parker Society volume. Now, Stokes must have heard about Turner's library in 1820, the year everybody heard about Turner's library. Turner and a friend, Hudson Gurney, had made an infamous bid for a lot put up by James Christie's London auction house. Christie was about to sell off a famous collection of early modern papers amassed by an 18th century collector who gloried in the name of the Reverend Dr. Cox Macro. When the two friends persuaded Christie to pull the Macro manuscripts, offering to purchase the entire lot prior to auction for the considerable sum of £700. Turner later regretted this decision, describing himself as so besotted by the prospect of owning the entire collection that he offered far too much for them. But in 1840, and in his conversations with George Stokes, it appears he was still clinging to all of them. The lot, number 23, contained reams of 16th century treasure, described in the catalog as a folio volume of, quote, 171 original papers and letters from some of the distinguished reformers and Puritans. It included autograph letters by Latimer, Ridley, Philpott, Bradford, Hooper, and John Fox. Thus it was only a few months after that first August letter, on 15 February 1841, that we find another letter from Stokes to Turner, this one more anxious than the first. It is worth citing at some length. Dear Sir, Ridley has papers through the first stages of editorship, but as the University of Cambridge Press is by the kind offer of the syndics to print the volumes of the Parker Society, we have made arrangements for additional editorial labor to render the books worthy of such an introduction to the public. You mentioned having a letter of Ridley in some respects differing from the translation of it in the Martyr's letters. May I request farther particulars? And if you think it should appear in the proposed edition or any notice of it, we would be much indebted to you for a transcript and for any observations that occur to you on the subject, which will be duly noted by the editor, to whom I should be glad to forward it. Now, noteworthy here is not just the fact that actually Turner didn't give him anything, but is the glimpse that Stokes gives us of what would turn out to be the Parker Society's claim to fame in an era rapidly distinguishing itself for its attention to and its obsession with historical archives, its unflagging thoroughness in tracking down the locations of all writings of the 16th century reformers, whether in Britain or abroad, and in its determination to do what their early prospectuses had promised, to republish the entire mass of the printed works of the leading divines of our Reformed Church, and to add the pieces from their pens, if any such could be found, that were still lying in manuscript unpublished. This claim to thoroughness and comprehension would form the basis for a general editorial strategy that, in the end, and as we shall see, raised and still raises more questions than it resolves. For only 5 days later, as the deadline for the remains of Nicholas Ridley, and I couldn't resist that, that is actually a copy of Ridley, and it does look like remains, doesn't it? It actually looks like his crumbling remains, loomed even larger. We find Stokes pestering Turner with even more urgency, if that was at all possible, letting slip in the process an integral insight into the Parker Society's intentions. Dear Sir, I reserve to myself the opportunity to address you again. I do so now that I can state the successful close of our subscription list to the exclusion of many late applicants, and with the support of that extended and varied nature, which justly entitles it to be considered as a national undertaking in many respects. Thus situated, I feel myself emboldened to address you again on the subject of the Précis of Ridley. The Parker Society edition of his writings will be a national one, and executed with many advantages. It would then be a pity that all which is known to exist should not be included. If you have such materials on which you place a value of a pecuniary nature, why cannot the Parker Society make terms for them? Surely it would be consulting the welfare of the undertaking in so doing. May I add that the many instances, I may say every instance to my knowledge, of the facilities offered to the Society, from those of the public libraries, to those of the Duke of Sussex, to those of the possessors of more humble and limited collections, all encourage us to believe that this edition of the writings of that English reformer will be a valuable one. Matthew Parker would be proud. This indefatigable attention to comprehensiveness was accompanied, however, by an editorial policy that rather paradoxically declared its hands-off nature at every opportunity. In every year of its existence, the Parker Society painstakingly and repeatedly explained, in the prospectuses and annual reports and in editors' introductions, its strict policy of editorial disinterestedness and non-intervention. Its ongoing pledge to its subscribers was encompassed not in what it would do, so much as in what it would not do, indeed in what it would never do, abridge, alter, or censor the text of any particular document that the Society had selected for publication. The Society's editorial method began with an elaborate disavowal of the writing of historiography. The Parker Society would offer their readers unblemished historic documents instead. As one pair of editors wrote in their introduction to the volume devoted to Matthew Parker, to consider Archbishop Parker's career in detail would be to write the ecclesiastical history of the most important part of the reign of Queen Elizabeth. Such a work, however valuable, is foreign to the purpose of the Parker Society, the design of which is to furnish materials rather than treatises, to publish authorities rather than draw conclusions. This is, of course, disingenuous. The Parker Society series was designed to make a united shelf of conclusions. It is therefore not so much in the subtleties of editorial practice. These are still excellent, accurate, useful editions, by the way. But in the grand sweep of text selection, political organization, and material presentation that we discern its work of religious opposition. In order to understand how the seemingly neutral, scholarly act of editing historical documents works so well to create bosom enemies, it is necessary instead to consider how campaigns against Roman Catholic outsiders could now intersect in the public mind with the declaring of a bitter war within the Victorian Church of England. The 19th century problem began with the nature of the 16th century Protestant Reformation, which was by necessity, given the mores of the era, radical, bloody, and in its first half-century rabidly partisan. It thus appears to have been a kind of embarrassment to some in the Victorian Church of England, kind of like that great uncle who spouts retrograde opinions over the Brussels sprouts at the Christmas dinner. From the first announcement of its intentions, then, the Society's aims drew not only kudos, but also skepticism from some quarters of the Anglo-American press. The Church of England Quarterly Review was the first to declare itself alarmed by the plans of the Parker Society. In 1841, one writer for this magazine, which was, as you might guess, friendly to the Oxford movement, proclaimed that, quote, all the excitement of Exeter Hall will not convince us that previous to Henry VIII there were neither virtue nor religion in England. Now, Exeter Hall might seem weird, but it was this 4,000-seat auditorium built on London's Strand in the early 1800s. It was used for holding religious and philanthropic meetings. These included events sponsored by the Protestant Reformation Society, newly founded in 1827, and the Protestant Association, revived in 1835, when that year was chosen as the tercentenary year of the English Reformation. By the 1840s, perhaps inevitably, the act of commemorating and enthusiastically celebrating the 16th century Reformation had become indelibly associated with Exeter Hall. And we might think an association not so much fortuitous as entirely obvious, and one never to be disavowed. But the review writer was in fact playing a strategic polemical hand. Exeter Hall had by the 1840s become known for a very low church constituency that could, and occasionally did, make common cause with dissenters, especially where anti-Catholicism was concerned. Only recently beneficiaries of political toleration themselves, Methodists, Baptists, and other nonconformists were often the most vehemently vocal opponents of papalism in Victorian Britain, enthusiastically espousing the Protestant Reformation, if not the Protestant Church of England. The proceedings could get noisy. Describing a rally held at Exeter Hall in 1849, Percival Lee commented in the satirical magazine Punch, the two chief speeches lasted an hour and a half each, my head aching through all the raving. Such violence, methinks, do only prove that there are other bigots besides papists, and is the worst means of enforcing any truth. For they that speak in anger and passion are commonly concluded by indifferent people to be in the wrong. And so with the very mention of Exeter Hall, our journalist for the Quarterly Review had tainted the Parker Society's anniversary interest in the 16th century Reformation with sly suggestions of their affinity to the radical and anti-authoritarian political aims of Methodists, Baptists, Unitarians, and other such belligerents. Furthermore, the journalist was not only criticizing the Parker Society, he was also challenging the Society's most significant claim, one that we first encountered in George Stokes's letters to Dawson Turner, one that relied on membership rolls to make an argument for the respectability and the representativeness of its subscription and publication list, that the Society and its works represented a unified national viewpoint, a kind of moral majority. The problem here is that at the time, they in fact did. Evangelicals constituted by far the largest part of the Church of England in the mid-1800s. But the Church of England Quarterly Review was primed to criticize the Parker Society with its quip about Exeter Hall because by 1841 it was able to contrast the Society's works and motives to those of yet another hastily organized subscription society, founded only a few months after the founding of the Parker Society, Keble, Pusey, and John Henry Newman's far more famous Library of Anglo-Catholic Theology. Now, Newman was lukewarm about this venture from the start, writing in January 1841, "I have never been for this. But under the circumstances, the Parker Society urging, their subscriptions being collected, and their first volume coming out, I suppose it must be done." Thus, the 1841 Library of Anglo-Catholic Theology was a counter response to the Parker Society's 1840 counter-response to Newman's 1838 Library of the Fathers series, which itself was a reaction to Lee Richmond's 1830s Fathers of the English Church series. Newman and his cohort began to concentrate then on inventing, defining, and publishing a new genre, this one called Anglo-Catholic theology. This was a corpus of 17th century English writers, most of whom now have thankfully sunk into a deserved obscurity. The new series opened with 10 volumes of Lancelot Andrewes, by far the least obscure and the best of the bunch, moved on through the remains of Archbishop William Laud, the least talented of the bunch, and other apologists for the doomed Church of Charles I, and finished up with late 17th century apologists for the Restoration settlement of Charles II. With the founding of the Library of Anglo-Catholic Theology, the church-related press, British, colonial, and American, eagerly acquainted their readers with stories of bibliographic competition and controversy within the church, reviewing collections of these well-edited historical documents with all the savage glee that other reviewers applied to bad Victorian novels. By the end of the 1840s, however, we can detect signs of battle fatigue in the reading public, which was perhaps overwhelmed by the magazine coverage, exhausted by the accelerated foundings of an astonishing number of similar subscription enterprises, literally dozens, and worn down by the sheer number of books arriving every single day by post. By 1847, a private seller advertised his or her entire Parker Society set so far, 30 volumes complete from commencement for £7.7 in the classified ad section of the Manchester Guardian. In May 1858, the London bookseller Edwin Slater advertised 200 volumes at £1 a volume of all books printed by the Parker Society, the Calvin Society, and the Ecclesiastical History Society. Henry Wheatley's 1879 bestseller, and it was a bestseller, folks, How to Make an Index, devotes a long paragraph to the Parker Society's innovations in alphabetic ordering, volume notation, and expeditious use of see also, but also adds at the end, rather wickedly, that, quote, "This index is the only volume issued by the Parker Society that is sought after, as the books themselves are a drug on the market." Even the druggists themselves admitted in their final report that the very cheapness of their volumes had caused them to multiply on subscribers' shelves, which in turn had led to a certain degree of disappointment in the ranks, mostly at the coarseness of 16th century language. Here, coarse does not mean crude or rude, but something darker, signaling a kind of cultural climate change. An 1847 article in the Prospective Review reported with exquisite sarcasm, "We have pleasure in selecting, from a mass of unreadable matter with which the high church and low church societies are inundating the press, one work that is deeply interesting and instructive. Its value lies in the genuine picture it exhibits of the manners of the sad era in which the occurrences took place, and the book teaches a great deal more, we believe, than its present publishers intend." The volume was the Parker Society's 1842 edition of the Examination and Writing of John Philpot, a volume mostly given over to transcriptions of heated debates between Philpot and his Catholic accusers, in which the arguments, true to their 16th century origins, are as ad hominem as they are well-versed in theology. The review allows us to detect a new religious and cultural mood emerging by the mid to late 1840s, one that had largely gone soft on confessional wars. This reporter deplored the current state of all such loud ecclesiastical ventures, which existed, in his opinion, only to instruct the public in what he called the vituperative eloquence of an intolerant past. With subscription book fatigue, then, came a certain public history fatigue, and the sense that religious conflict was an impediment to social progress and genteel civilization. An experiment in serious popular religious education on a standardized national controversial scale had come to an end. The hundreds of books it spawned remain on the shelves, left to gather dust, or to be checked out by grateful historians of the English Reformation, and now one of Victorian controversy. Thank you very much.